Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the 2025 edition of the OECD Skills Outlook. We will hear a short video address by the Secretary General of the OECD, Matthias Cormann, who will present the report's key findings. And then Andreas Schleicher, the OECD Director for Education and Skills, and Stefano Scarpetta, the OECD Director for Employment, Labour and Social Affairs, will go into some more details of those key findings. And we'll then have time for some questions and answers from journalists. I'd just like to remind them that they can use the chat function in Zoom to ask their questions. Thank you. If we could now start the video address, that would be great.
A very warm welcome to this launch of the 2025 OECD Skills Outlook on building the skills of the 21st century for all. This outlook, published every 2 years, provides the OECD's latest data and analysis on skills development and demand, as well as the education and training policies we need to unlock innovation and stronger productivity growth, to address labour shortages, particularly those resulting from population ageing, and to prepare people for success in labour markets that are being reshaped by digitalisation, AI, and other structural changes in our economies. This edition of the Skills Outlook provides new analysis on how factors beyond people's control can shape their skills development and career opportunities. Using data from OECD and other large-scale assessments, the report shows that factors such as family background and gender continue to have a significant impact on individuals' education and labour market outcomes. For example, 40% of adults who grew up in cities earned a bachelor's degree or higher qualification, compared to only 26% of those who grew up in villages. Among adults whose parents worked in managerial, professional or technical roles, 53% have attained a bachelor's degree or higher qualification, which compares to only 23% of those whose parents worked in lower skilled jobs, such as machine operators, cleaners or farm workers. These gaps are also reflected in labour market outcomes. Adults whose parents completed tertiary education are 2.7 percentage points more likely to be in employment, and they earn on average 11% more per hour than their peers whose parents completed lower levels of education. Our analysis shows that these gaps are largely explained by differences in education, skills, and participation in lifelong learning, making clear the key role that skills policies play in fostering equality of opportunity and opportunity to get ahead. This year's Outlook also highlights important differences in skills development among boys and girls. At the age of 15, boys tend to outperform girls in mathematics, financial literacy, and creative problem solving. Girls, on the other hand, perform better in reading, civic knowledge, collaborative problem solving, and creative thinking. These differences tend to widen over time as boys and girls pursue different educational and career paths. For example, among individuals born in 1984, the gender gap in mathematics skills increased by 1/3 between the ages of 10 and 15. Between the ages of 10 and 37 to 39, the gap quadrupled. Our analysis points to two policy priorities to build stronger education and training systems and ultimately advance equality of opportunity in this context. First, enhancing early childhood education and providing tailored educational support for students who need it. This means ensuring that every child has access to at least 1 or 2 years of affordable, high-quality pre-primary education. Targeting financial and human resources to support disadvantaged students, for example, assigning experienced teachers to the most challenging schools, and tackling the stereotypes that influence boys' and girls' study choices. Countries such as Finland and Sweden, for example, combine near universal access to high-quality early childhood education and care with strong investment in staff and curricula, helping to narrow socio-economic gaps in school readiness. The United Kingdom's Best Start programme is another successful example, providing one-stop hubs in disadvantaged areas that bring together early learning, health and parenting support. Other initiatives are helping to challenge gender stereotypes and build strong social and emotional skills. These include Girls in Maths in France, a U2 in IT in Slovakia, In Their Shoes in Spain, and Chile's Life Skills program. Each of these initiatives demonstrate how schools can help address stereotypes, strengthen social and emotional skills, and raise aspirations for all students. Second, countries must build adult learning systems that are easy to access, affordable, and aligned with labour market needs, especially for adults with lower skill levels. Across the OECD, only 19% of adults without an upper secondary qualification take part in adult learning, compared to 61% of those with a tertiary education. Closing this gap will require the development of high-quality, relevant adult education and training offerings through robust accreditation systems. And it will require tackling barriers to adults' participation in education and training, especially cost and time, by providing targeted financial support such as learning vouchers, subsidies or tax credits for employers, and by enhancing the availability of flexible learning options such as modular courses, micro-credentials, and online programs that help people balance learning time with work and family responsibilities. For example, France's Compte Personnel de Formation and Singapore's Skills Future Credit provide adults with personal training resources they can use throughout their careers, with additional support for those with lower qualifications. And Norway's Skills Plus program takes a targeted approach to funding basic skills training in the workplace for lower skilled workers. So in conclusion, a well-functioning education and training systems are powerful engines of individual opportunity and broader economic growth and innovation. The OECD remains fully committed to supporting member and partner countries with evidence-based policy recommendations on building skills effectively at every stage of life, from early childhood education to adult training for older workers and everything in between. In April next year, the government of Turkey and the OECD will together host ministers at the 2026 OECD Skills Summit in Istanbul. We hope to see you all there. Ministers there will discuss how to develop people's skills to their full potential while navigating demographic shifts and the digital and green transitions which are reshaping our economies and our societies. And with that, I will leave it to Stefano Scarpetta and Andreas Schleicher, the directors of our Employment, Labour and Social Affairs and of Education and Skills, to present the findings of this year's Skills Outlook in greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, and good morning to everyone. The launch of our Skills Outlook is always a very special moment for us because it brings together the whole range of perspectives on skills, from how we develop the right skills to how we make sure that people get opportunities to use their skills effectively at work and in life. And also most importantly, of course, what governments can do to extend that opportunity to all, as you just heard from our Secretary General. And this year we gave a special focus on how social background, gender, immigrant background, age, and where people grew up shape the development and use of skills across the entire life course, from the earliest years to learning at the workplace and beyond. And the results that Matthias Kormann anticipated, and we will show now in greater detail, are on the one hand sobering if we see how little progress has been achieved over the last 2 decades, but also motivating by looking at how some countries are so much more successful in countering social disadvantage than others. Let me start, perhaps with the most sobering picture. You can see here that across countries, social background is a hugely predictive factor behind differences in adult literacy. And adult literacy is sort of the basic kind of skill with which gives you access to participation in work and in life. You can see adults whose parents completed tertiary education have significantly higher levels of literacy than those whose parents did not, and significantly adults whose parents worked as professionals, as managers or associate professionals, have a lot better literacy skills than those whose parents work in sort of less prestigious occupations. So parental education, parental occupation, hugely predictive. Interestingly, differences related to a place of birth or immigrant background are actually a lot smaller, but still sizable. And then at the end, you see gender in literacy is actually fairly small. It evolves over the life cycle. At the beginning, girls have an advantage, and then later women, that advantage diminishes largely because men often get jobs that are more literacy intensive. But that's sort of the overall picture. And what you can also see is that some of this inequality is ingrained very early on in life. Here you can see students' academic performance at the age of 15. Now, here, in this case, in numeracy, another of those foundation skills. Take a country from the middle of the league table, like the Slovak Republic, and look at the performance gap between the students from the most disadvantaged and the wealthiest families, expressed here by the first and ninth deciles on the social distribution. You can see that social gap almost spans the world. You see students from disadvantaged backgrounds in the Slovak Republic having literacy skills like you'd expect them, in the least proficient countries, and then students from privileged backgrounds coming out right on top of the global league tables. Now, not every country has as large disparities than the Slovak Republic, but the Slovak Republic is far not alone. But then, you see how comparably disadvantaged students in Switzerland have math skills that match an average performer in the Slovak Republic. And then, when you look at the most, disadvantaged students in Macau, you can see they almost reach the performance of the most privileged students in the Slovak Republic. They have the same different disadvantaged background, but top-level performance. And that tells us that poverty need not be destiny, and that students from all social backgrounds can actually reach high-performance standards. Intelligence is equally distributed. It's opportunity that is not. And closing that gap is, in a way, the biggest promise of a good education. If you come from a privileged family background, you'll always have open doors in life. There is always someone who's going to support you. But if you come from a poor background, a good, education is often your only chance to succeed. You just get one single chance in life, and that is, find a great teacher and a good school. If you miss that boat, as our Secretary General Matthias Cormann has already outlined, life is going to work against you. The odds are stacked against you in, moving up the value chain later on. You can see here how the social gap varies across countries. It's represented here by the orange diamond. You can see in some countries here on the left side, it is huge. In other countries on the right side, those systems are much better in mediating social disadvantage. So it shows us how powerful society's policy can actually be. Compared to that, the gender gap, that's here in purple, is actually quite small. And education has made lots of progress in closing gender gaps, but not actually that much progress when it comes to social disadvantage. I want to add one more dimension to this and go even earlier. This was about 15-year-olds. Let's look at 5-year-olds, very early on in life. And, we talk a lot about, early childhood education and care these days, but, you can see the social gap at age 5 and disadvantaged 5-year-olds are almost 20 months behind in pro-social behavior. And still, about a year in emergent literacy. That's at the start of the life. Imagine you're a 5-year-old child and you're already 2 years behind just because you come from disadvantage. And that is despite all the efforts that countries have made in early childhood education. But again, we can see that poverty need not be destiny. And that's really the most encouraging part. You can see here again, the performance gap between disadvantaged and advantaged children at the age of 5. That is not written in stone. You can see here where parents are involved in early childhood education and care and read to their children and invest in their social and emotional skills. You can see disadvantaged children do as well as the average child. And then, where you add strong home learning environments, good parental involvement, the most disadvantaged children do as well as those from the most privileged backgrounds. That's really an impressive result. We have many tools to create a level playing field if we join forces between high quality provision and then also engagement of families. Now, you can see clearly the most disadvantaged families children can catch up. No? What can governments do? Well, there's nothing more important than investing in high quality, accessible early childhood education and care systems. Now, moving from access to quality, moving from care to building, strong foundations. And also, it's important to combine those with targeted measures for disadvantaged families. Now, we can see that well in Finland. In Sweden, now you could see those present smaller socioeconomic gaps in readiness, and that is because those countries are very, very good in aligning resources with needs and in making sure that every child has a great start. Integrating services, linking education with health, for example, can also be important to strengthen outcome for children and reduce lasting effects of social and economic disadvantage. The United Kingdom's Sure Start Children's Centres, nowadays they call it Best Start, provide a particularly effective example, and you heard that already in the remarks of Matthias Korman. So those are effective devices that we can do both to make sure that children have a good start in early childhood education and that we relate what's happening there with services around them. Second, it's very important that education systems also balance excellence, equity, and labor market relevance, developing the right skills for all. Funding formulas can be very effective, directing resources to where the challenges are most significant, ensuring that curricula, what students learn, is adapted to what they will need in the future. And that includes, core 21st century skills, literacy, numeracy, problem solving, social emotional learning. All those are important. You can look at Spain's PROA Plus program that has been actually quite effective in reducing school dropout. Spain used to be one of the countries with the largest dropout, and now actually is moving very rapidly forward, already below the European benchmark. And it has worked particularly well in disadvantaged areas. That's what makes it so interesting. And it has, through a focus on digitalization, modernization of infrastructure, and again, from early childhood education and care right up to higher education. The higher education access route in Ireland is also a good example, more focused on facilitating students from disadvantaged backgrounds entering higher education by providing places for those who meet very specific criteria. Let me come back to the trends. Now, what you can see clearly is how some of the patterns that I showed you early in life, for 5 and 15-year-olds, actually extend into adulthood as young people transition into further education, training, employment, and so on, and even get, abbreviated. The first thing you see is that the results are remarkably stable across cohorts. You see here data for 1984, then 93 and 96. In other words, the dots are on the same spot. Not much has changed over past, decades. And second, as young people transition into adulthood, as you move, to the right on the axis, skill disparities by parental background grow larger. So issues that we do not address at the beginning of people's lives tend to just, accelerate. You see how the socioeconomic advantage increases with age, and it means that early differences that are not fully closed by the time young people complete compulsory schooling then compound with the opportunities they get. And it's not so difficult to understand. Sometimes, employers are not likely to invest in those who need it most because, it's more expensive. And at the same time, people who have not been doing well in school may not want to go back to the kind of learning they experienced in school. Finally, you can see for gender, that's actually, sorry, I just try to move this slide. No, I think now it moved many slides. You can see for gender, men have an advantage early on, and that advantage grows as they grow older or get more experienced, while women's advantage in literacy actually diminishes over the life course. And this is actually a story about the utilization of skills. Now, you develop skills that you use and you lose skills that you do not use. And that is the right moment for me to pass on the floor to my colleague, Stefano Scarpetta.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Let me indeed move some step forward into the main content of this skills outlook. The first point I would like to highlight is that while we know very well that there are differences between boys and girls in the field of study when they go to tertiary education, well, the point that is shown in this chart, this also affects their choices when they enroll in upper and the post-secondary vocational education programs. You see the blue diamond in the chart, or in the short cycle tertiary program, which is the pink dot in the chart. In fact, there are large differences in the direction, in the pathways that actually boys and girls do take. And this, of course, has a significant impact also on their labor market outcome. For example, young men are 31 percentage points more likely than women to complete vocational education and training programs in engineering and manufacturing, while women are 21 percentage points more likely to have completed the vocational education and training programs in business administration, in economics, but also in personal and community services. So again, to some extent, the pathways diverge not only when boys and girls reach tertiary education, but also when they enroll in technical vocational education. The second observation I'd like to share is that the difference in socio-economic condition of the family in which young people actually grow up tend to shape also the level of education and skills when they grow up and become adult and enter the labor market. What you have the difference in numeracy associated with the parents with high status versus low status occupation. On average, across the OECD countries, the adults whose parents work as manager, professional, associate professional, those that again we refer to be high status occupation, have numeracy skills that are about 30% of a standard deviation, significantly higher than those whose parents actually work in other type of occupation, lower status type of occupation. See the differences across countries, so there is a lot that actually country can do to some extent to reduce the impact that the socioeconomic condition have, not only in the education pathway, in the educational outcome, but actually the skills outcome when people grow up and become adults. The question is, of course, where does it come from? And this is shown in this chart because here we look at the, we control, if you like, for the education and attainment of the adults. And you can see that once we take into account the level of education that individuals have achieved, in this case, in numeracy, then the gap in terms of the observed skill numeracy actually halves on average across the OECD country. We move from 30% of a standard deviation to 14%. So to some extent, the socioeconomic impact on the outcomes in terms of skills of the adult is largely determined by the different experience in terms of education and the quality of education, the type of education that the individual actually go through from, again, as Andrea said, from early childhood education all the way to formal education and then into the labor market. So to some extent, the future in terms of actual skills, which are key, of course, for the labor market outcome, is shaped very early on in life and then tend to affect the way in which actually individuals grew up and eventually develop the skills and they use these skills into the labor market. But there are large differences across the country as well. In Chile, for example, the gap shrinks from 35% to 7%. And this suggests that the difference in educational opportunities are particularly important to in the way in which social the economic divides affect the education and the skills outcome of the individual. This is less the case in the other countries in which when we control for education, the difference in the actual performance of, if you like, in numeracy is affected. Now, the other point we would like to say is also that the socioeconomic condition affect the skills outcome over and above the working life of individuals, not only during their education period, but actually this shapes also the way in which they perform into the labor market. The figure in this case shows that the workers engage in different type of training depending on their qualification. So the effect of socioeconomic condition on qualification then affects the type of training they participate on. Here you have the representation of those with tertiary level of education versus those with the who are more represented in tertiary level of education, those who are not. And you can see that at the bottom of this chart, those with tertiary level of education are definitely overrepresented in a number of key type of training. Those on reading and writing skills, project management, foreign language, skill involving numbers, calculating skills, and so on and so forth, while those with less than tertiary level of education tend to be more involved in different type of training, which potentially actually tend to perpetuate the gap in the overall skills they have, because they do not allow to actually acquire the kind of skill which are very high in demand, that would potentially allow them to reach out to better work opportunities. So to some extent, the training pathways that individuals perform during the working life tend to perpetuate the gaps which are built up during the educational period. Now, the other observation is that there are also different gaps when we look at the gender gaps in the reason why men and women participate or actually do not participate in training. Here you see those reasons why women actually tend to not participate in training compared to men. And you can see that women are definitely much more represented among the reason for not participating in training is family responsibility, lack of money, unexpected event. So these are all conditions that may prevent women more than men to actually participate in training. So there are barriers for everybody, and we know that the low skill tend to participate less in training, but there is also a clear gender divide. For women, it's much more difficult sometimes to participate in training because they have also family responsibilities, and these family responsibilities are not equally shared between the father and the mother, or because there are maybe unexpected events. The child might be sick and therefore they might not be participating in training. So again, to some extent, it's not just education, it's not actually to training, but actually the need to make sure that everyone could have the same chances to not only develop, but also adapt their skill during the working life. And we have to make sure that we remove the barriers to participation in training, which may also have a gender dimension. We have to take that into account. Now, the fourth point I want to mention, this is the same chart that Andrea showed you before, but this time we're looking at one of the key labor market outcomes. So the percentage difference in hourly wages, depending on different type of socioeconomic condition. You see men versus women, there is a 14% gap in hourly pay. Then you see the migrant and non-migrant status. You see again whether the adult come from a family with high status occupational parents or not, or those parents who have a tertiary level of education versus those that did not have a tertiary education. So you see that socioeconomic condition and gender do shape significantly the differences in outcome, in labor market outcome, in this case, in terms of hourly wages. But let's ask ourselves, where does it come from? So this is the same chart I showed you before with the percentage difference in hourly wages in which we control for socio-economic condition between those with tertiary educated parents. So you can see again, these differences are very large across the OECD countries, but also vary a lot across the country. So again, policy make a difference in terms of shaping the role of socioeconomic conditions into the outcome, with in this case, labor market outcome for the adults. Let's ask ourselves if we control in this case for the level of not only for socioeconomic characteristics, but also for the skills and lifelong learning experience of individuals. This is the little diamond that is shown in this chart. So if we control for the level of skills and the lifelong learning, we see that this gap is completely wiped out. So this means that basically the socioeconomic condition translate into difference in labor market outcome, basically by shaping different educational pathways, different type of studies, the quality of this learning, and also to some extent the lifelong learning experience of the individual. If we control for that, there are no longer gaps. So the labor market actually rewards the skills. The question is that people do not have access to these skills, cannot reach the same level of skills, almost beyond their capabilities, because of the strong influence of socioeconomic conditions on their ability to perform well in education and also in lifelong learning. Now let's do the same exercise, but this time we look at the gender gap. I mentioned before that there are significant gender gaps in hourly wages. Here you have the difference across the board. We move from almost 40% difference in Japan, an average of the OECD country, which is at 14%. But then let's ask the same question. So let's control for the actual skills and the lifelong learning experience of men and women. And you can see that here actually the gap is not reduced at all. If anything, actually in a number of countries, the gap increases. This points to the fact that it's not just the educational pathways difference between men and women, or young men and young women, but actually labor market outcome do play a role. This is related to occupational segregation. The field of study lead women into certain occupation. This occupation may lead, even if they have the same level of foundational skills, lead to lower level of wages. They may actually have different career pattern, because sometimes they might have to be absent from work because they have to take care of their children. So to some extent here, it's not just educational pathways, but actually labor market condition, labor market policy that do make this gap, gender gap, actually persisting, in some cases even widening, because we know that girls now tend to achieve in a higher level of education than boys during the educational period. Now, let me move into another important point, into the policy. Well, so what can be done? And here I'd like to make three main points. First, I think very much building on what Andreas was saying, yes, we have to make sure that everybody, regardless of the socioeconomic condition of the family in which they grew up, have the same opportunity from early childhood education to formal education to higher level education. But I think this has to be combined with the equal access to lifelong learning opportunities. And this is particularly important because we know that the labor market is changing so rapidly, the demand for skill is evolving so rapidly, that I think giving second chances opportunity to everybody to adapt their skills and competences is very, very important. Policy should prioritize access to, for adults, in particular with low level of specific skills proficiency, the older workers, those in precarious, less stable jobs, ensuring that time, cost, and information barriers do not prevent their participation. To tackle cost barriers and encourage lifelong learning, government can also offer training financial incentive. For example, the individual learning account that a number of countries, including France and Singapore, but a number of other European countries have put in place. Let me mention the case of Norway's Skill Plus program that offer resources for employers to deliver workplace-based training in literacy, numeracy, and digital and communication skill, supporting workers with low qualifications and encouraging firms to invest in the workforce development. The second is actually comprehensive bias-free career guidance. It's actually quite important to see that not everyone receives career guidance when actually they make important choices into the labor market. And here government can expand the counseling from school to actually public employment services in the use of digital tools, for example, to personalize the support. This effort can actually help people identify training opportunities, navigate the transitions into the labor market, and address some persistent stereotypes that limit to some extent the career aspiration for those coming from low socioeconomic background. Again, a few examples from France, the Girls and Math programs encourage girls to choose more mathematics-intensive study pathways throughout their formal schooling and end up enrolling mathematics-intensive study pathways. The Slovak Republic encouraging girls to enroll more in ICT studies, offering coding workshops and secondary school girls, upskilling for career changes and teacher training. Or in the case of Australia, with the Australia College and Nursing campaign on the German Boys' Day in Modern Man to Care, we actually encourage boys to enroll more in a training program that actually focus on nursing and care programs. So again, avoid the gender stereotype in some type of profession, which is also very important. And finally, I think we have to strengthen the adoption among business. It's not just a matter for government, but business can play and should play an important role to actually focus directly on the skills that individuals have and not only the qualification the individual possess. This is very important. And this means basically developing transparent and framework for skill assessment, recognition, the credential portability that can promote a job mobility and better use of talent. I mean, qualification themselves only tell us a little bit of the skill, the actual skill that the individual have, and the skill-based hiring, for example, is something really enable to give value to the actual skill that the individual have, almost regardless of the level of qualification they have received. For instance, several US states have already removed the degree requirements for many public roles. A government can also steer the skill-first culture through strategies such as the EU Union Skill Initiative, which actually invests in lifelong learning, reskilling, and tools to support the job matching. This is the European Skill Competence and Qualification and Occupation Programs. So these are some of the many recommendations, the Skills Outlook, but I think as the Secretary General Andreas was saying, it is fairly sobering that the socio-economic conditions still have a huge role in shaping educational pathways, educational outcome, the actual skills individuals possess, and actually perpetuate into the labor market, leading to significant impact on the labor market outcomes. And with that, let me just end my presentation, and both Andreas and I very much look forward for your question and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. We'll move straight to questions now. We have a question here on trends as to whether skills inequalities are getting better or worse over time. I don't know whether Andreas or Stefano wants to take that one.
Well, maybe I can start by saying that unfortunately, and this is the result of the adult skills survey that we launched in the last year and refers to 2023 compared to 2012, we actually see a widening of the gap. So socioeconomic condition in 14 of the OECD countries have actually played an even stronger role in shaping, in particular, the performance of those at the lower end of the skill distribution. So this is very problematic because we hope that through all the effort that countries have made, we have been able to basically support those who have coming from low socioeconomic background, who have more difficulty in enrolling in education and achieving the same educational outcome. Actually, in 14 of the OECD countries, those with highly educated parents have actually performed better, and those at the lower end, coming from parents with low level of education, have performed worse. And this is particularly problematic. So again, more effort need to be made with a particular focus, starting from early childhood education all the way through lifelong learning, to help those who, just because they're born in a family with fewer opportunities, to get support, to be able to choose a different, better, if you like, education pathways, actually to perform better.
Yeah, the only nuance I would add to this is that this is the average picture, but trends have actually evolved quite differently across countries, and that can make us, put a little bit more optimism into this, that there actually have been some countries that have been able to move the needle and close some of the social gaps, and that shows again that good policy really is quite powerful in this respect. But as Stefano said, on average, it has been pretty stagnant, pretty stable.
Thank you, Andreas. We have a question here about artificial intelligence, AI, in terms of what impact you think it will have on skills demand, and what role could AI play in building people's skills?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a question that everyone debates. I mean, AI certainly has the potential to compensate for skill gaps, and it does so, particularly, for people with special needs. I think AI is going to augment their skills. But, history shows that technology has tended to amplify skill differentials rather than compensate for skill gaps. It super empowers those who have the right foundation skills and reduces opportunities for people. We do not know how this is going to play out with AI in the long run, but that's the long story of technology, the further polarization of skill differentials. But again, on the more optimistic side, AI clearly has the potential to augment for skill gaps. No? And it does certainly so for specific population groups.
Let me just maybe add a couple of points on that, because it's, again, as Andrea said, the evidence is still not completely clear-cut. But what is interesting is that when we look specifically at generative AI, some of the emerging evidence suggests that these may actually benefit not only those at a high level of skills, the top skill level, but actually those with the intermediate level of skill. This is very different from previous generation of the digital technology that tend to reward more those with high level of skills. And this is because it can actually augment more the capabilities of those with intermediate level of skills. But these individuals need at least a minimum level of digital skills in order to be able to work side by side with the generative AI. So by no means Gen AI can actually address all the gaps we have shown up in terms of skill deficiencies or skill gaps that to some extent, again, are driven very largely by the socioeconomic condition of the children, then sort of adolescent and then adults when they enter into the labor market. The other point in which, again, the evidence is still out there is that AI and Gen AI can change the way in which adult learning actually takes place. Potentially can actually allow to shorter courses, much more targeted to the specific need of individuals and companies, and make these much more available, in particular for those who are more disadvantaged. I mean, before we said that the barriers to access to adult learning is actually related to financial resources. Some people says, I cannot participate in training because I don't have the resources for doing that. But the other main barrier is actually time. If you're working a small and medium-sized enterprise, you might not have the time to be away from your workplace. Now, Gen AI, potentially, if you use properly, can reduce the time, can make the course more targeted, and therefore more available also for the workers who might be more disadvantaged. So it can be an equalizing factor. It really depends how these technology is actually used and whether there is sufficient investment to actually make sure that can be a tool to reduce some of the disparities that materialize into the labor market, into access of lifelong learning and training opportunities.
Thank you, Stefano. We have one last question here, asking about data and analysis in the Outlook. Do we estimate how big the socioeconomic cost of the skills gap is across the OECD?
Well, I think the evidence is shown very clearly in the chart I show you by how socioeconomic condition of the parents shape the wage gap differential. I mean, this tells you that by not focusing on those who have potentially more difficulties in achieving high level of education and high level of skills, actually to some extent are paid less. And this is actually driven largely by the educational experience. So by eliminating the gaps that materialize from early childhood and then develop all the way through formal education and continue, unfortunately, even during training in adulthood, well, then we can reduce the wage gap. This means basically enhancing the productivity of these workers. And let me say that this is particularly important in the context in which in many, if not most of the OECD countries, we're actually aging. Again, we have launched only a few months ago the employment outlook, and basically the working age population in the OECD countries has reached a plateau. And going forward to 2060, the working age population will decline. On average by 8 percentage points in the OECD, in some countries by 30%, like Japan, Korea, Italy. This means that we will have fewer workers to actually, work in the labor market. And that means that we need to use all the talents we have. And this means that by reducing the educational gaps, the skill gaps, and giving everybody the same opportunity of lifelong learning, we can actually boost the productivity of the workforce in a context in which the size of this workforce may actually be declined. So we have to compensate for the shortage of workers to some extent with actually a strengthening of the average productivity of the workforce. And by doing that, we have to focus to some extent of those at the lower end of the labor productivity scale.
Yeah, we can actually add to this a perspective of historical growth regressions. I mean, it's not so much covered in this specific skills outlook, but there are actually efforts to estimate, what it would bring to the economy if we would address the skills gap. And it actually, if you look at, for example, one benchmark is if every 15-year-olds would reach the foundation skill level on the PISA scale, which is not very ambitious. It's like level 2. every 15-year-old would have those foundation skills. Then over the lifetime of those people, you add between 3 and 10 times of the size of current economies, depending on the country. So the kind of long-term economic outcomes for countries as a whole are simply enormous. You could even say there is no conceivable investment, no conceivable cost of improving skills that would not be, have huge returns in the long run to economy. So there is that kind of historical growth regressions perspective.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you, Stefano. That's the last of the questions. So with that, we'll close today's launch. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.